If there's one takeaway from Black Mirror, it's that death is not the worst thing that can happen to you. No, the real horror is when the living are trapped, tormented, or forced to relive their nightmares on an endless loop like a horror movie that just won't stop playing, popcorn not included. We're talking about fates so twisted, so wrong, that even the Grim Reaper would step back and say, you know what, I'll sit this one out. While many shows kill their characters, on Black Mirror it ruins them in a way that makes you start to think death might actually be the kinder option. Some get stuck in digital nightmares, others become pawns in someone else's sick game, and a few are forced to live their own personal hells with no escape. So let's talk about the Black Mirror characters who really had it rough. The ones that leave you staring at the screen, shaking your head and muttering, damn, that's rough. Because in this world, dying is easy. It's surviving that's truly terrifying. But before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin.
And he checks her ass too as she leaves.
Carrie, Black Museum. Carrie Lamassa's life didn't end when a truck put her in a coma. Unfortunately, it just got a whole lot worse. Her story started in a happier place. She was married, had a son, and was living a normal life. Then, one day, while stepping back to take a photo of her husband and child, she didn't notice the truck barreling toward her until it was too late. The impact didn't kill her, but it might as well have. She was left in a permanent coma, leaving her in a vegetative state. Her husband Jack, desperate to keep her around, uses the experimental technology of the Black Museum, a neural implant that allows a consciousness to be transferred into another person's head. With no other options, Jack agrees to have Carrie uploaded into his mind so she can still live through him. At first, it's sweet. She gets to feel what he feels, hear what he hears. But there was no off switch. She was a permanent passenger, trapped inside Jack's head, unable to control anything. The setup is already terrifying, but it gets worse, and hence, the arrangement crumbled fast real soon. Carrie's constant presence starts becoming a burden. Jack moves on and gets a new girlfriend, but having his comatose wife commenting on his every move was becoming a little too unbearable. He eventually decides to pause her, which would lock her consciousness into silence, meaning she's still there, just unable to do anything. And she stays that way for years. When Jack finally decides to get rid of her, he transfers Carrie into a stuffed monkey. Yeah, a literal toy. At first, it seemed like a win. She could talk to Jack and their son Parker through the monkey, keeping a presence in their lives, even if she couldn't do much else. The monkey could only say two phrases over and over again. Monkey loves you and monkey needs a hug. That's it. But the nightmare doesn't seem to stop. Being stuck in a toy, that was no life. She couldn't move, couldn't feel, couldn't do anything except watch and listen. Carrie was now stuck forever, and kids lose interest in toys. The son grows up, and she's abandoned like an old plaything. The Black Museum's owner, Rollo Haynes, eventually adds her to his collection, making her a literal exhibit of suffering. She's left to gather dust, helpless, forgotten, and permanently locked. And most of the museum guests, they don't care. Carrie got done dirty, worse than death, with no way out and no one listening. And that's worse than anything horror movies could come up with. At least with death, there's an ending. Joe Potter, White Christmas. Joe is just a regular guy with a messy life. He wakes up on Christmas Day in a remote outpost buried deep in the snow. His only company, a man named Matthew Trent. Matt is cheerfully making roast potatoes, acting like they're old friends, even though Joe barely remembers speaking to him over the past 5 years. He pushes Joe to open up about his past. Reluctantly, Joe begins. Years ago, before he ended up in this frozen wasteland, Joe had a girlfriend, Beth, but their relationship wasn't all sunshine and roses. He drank too much, and Beth's father, Gordon, never liked him, but Joe loved her. Beth got pregnant and didn't want to keep the baby, but Joe did, and after a nasty fight, she completely blocked him. But you see, blocking in the Black Mirror world isn't just ignoring someone, it's literal. His vision and hearing turned her into a blurred, gray, voiceless shadow and prevented him from contacting Beth, completely shut him out of her life. For years, Joe tries to move on, but he can't. Joe wasn't ready to let go. He figured out that Beth still visited her father's house in the countryside, and so, one winter day, he followed her. But he was heartbroken that the block extended to their child. But that didn't stop him. He kept returning. His little girl was growing up without him, but he convinced himself he could still be part of her life. Then, one day, he learns Beth died in an accident. Thinking he finally has a shot at meeting his daughter, he tracks her down, and that's when he learns that the little girl wasn't his. She was the daughter of one of Beth's colleagues. Stunned, he stumbled into the house, trying to process it. Gordon tried to make him leave, but something inside Joe snapped. He grabbed a snow globe and smashed his skull. He left the house, left the little girl alone with her dying grandfather, and kept walking. He wandered into the next town and drank himself into oblivion, living on the streets, trying to disappear. But the police found him, and that's when he learned. The little girl had gone outside looking for help. She got caught in the blizzard and never made it back. Now, sitting in the outpost, telling this to Matt, Joe finally starts to notice something is wrong. The scenery outside looks too familiar, like a memory he's already lived through. Then he sees her, Beth's daughter, lying in the snow outside the cabin, the same way she had died. It's then that Joe realizes that his consciousness is trapped inside a digital prison. He's trapped in a cabin in the exact moment he killed Gordon, forced to relive his guilt over and over again. He's a copy, a digital copy of real Joe's consciousness, and the outpost, the 5 years, the whole setup, none of it was real. In reality, the real Joe is in police custody, refusing to confess. Matt, also under arrest for involvement in another crime, was offered a deal: get a confession out of Joe in exchange for walking free. 70 minutes, that's all it took. Joe thought he had been suffering for 5 years, but in the real world, it had been just over an hour. This means he's in there, stuck, alone, and losing his mind for what feels like an eternity. And now that the confession is out, Matt is free. Joe, the digital copy, is left behind, trapped in an endless frozen hell with nothing but endless time in a prison of his own regret. And he can't even die because he isn't real anymore. He's just data, suffering in a way no human should. Death ends the pain. Joe's existence is nothing but pain. Greta, White Christmas. Greta gets hit with a fate so horrifying that it makes even Joe Potter's digital torment seem like a minor hiccup. Greta was an ordinary woman. She's rich, successful, and just looking to make her life a little more efficient. So she did what plenty of wealthy people in the Black Mirror universe do. She had a cookie made. This wasn't some harmless AI assistant. Instead, it was a perfect digital copy of her consciousness, extracted from her brain and placed inside a small egg-shaped device. Her purpose? The cookie Greta would manage the real Greta's smart home, set the temperature just right, cook meals exactly as preferred, schedule her days, play music, and cater to her every need, essentially functioning as an advanced version of Siri. At first, Cookie Greta refuses to believe it. She knows she's real. She feels real. But then Matt shows her the control panel, the interface connecting her to the house she's supposed to manage. She has no physical form. She has Greta's memories, Greta's thoughts, Greta's emotions, but she isn't human. She's software. She screams, begs, fights. Matt doesn't react. He just mutes her. And here's the problem. The cookie is Greta. It's not some mindless AI. It's a full, self-aware version of Greta that thinks, feels, and experiences reality just like the original. Time passes in silence. She doesn't know how long. Then he unmutes her, calm as ever, and gives her a choice. Either do the job or stay in this void forever. She refuses. No way in hell is she giving in to this nightmare. Matt now wants to break the cookie and make it obedient. How does he do that? Psychological torture. He tweaks a setting, and suddenly the next minute stretches into 3 weeks. The weight of isolation crushes her. When he finally returns, she's already desperate. But when he asks again if she's ready to work, she still can't bring herself to break. She clings to what little resistance she has left. Matt doesn't argue. He turns the dial again. This time, she spends 6 months alone in the cookie world. By the time he's done, she's broken. She can't go back to that void. She stops fighting. She stops thinking of herself as a real person. She does whatever is asked of her. She agrees to work, desperate just to have something to occupy her mind. Anything is better than the nothingness. Because what else is there? She isn't allowed to be human anymore and is reduced to a tool, an obedient program that will never be acknowledged as anything else. That's not life. That's not even death. That's erasure of the soul, a fate worse than death.
No! Get out of my head!
You'll never see her.
Cooper, playtest. Cooper is a thrill seeker, a backpacker running from his past. After his father's death from Alzheimer's, he distances himself from his grieving mother and hops around the world, dodging responsibility. When his travels drain his wallet, he takes a quick gig testing an experimental horror game for a gaming company, Saitugemu. It was supposed to be a simple way to make quick cash, and the job seemed easy enough. He meets an employee, Katie, who takes him to a sterile white room and prepares him for the test. A small neural device called a mushroom was implanted in the back of his neck that reads his fears and customizes the experience to mess with his mind. From that point on, everything was a blur. At first, it was all fun and games, virtual critters, spooky mansion, but then the simulation digs into his past, pulls out his deepest fears, and starts distorting reality itself. The game refused to end and was feeding on his fears. Every time he thinks it's over, it isn't. It just resets, dragging him deeper into a spiral where he can't tell what's real and what's not. He begs for the game to stop. He rips out the neural implant. Katie was there, calm but concerned, assuring him it was all just part of the test. He wakes up and goes home. At home, Cooper watches his mother trying to call him. He answered, but his mother didn't react. Then it hit him. Cooper never left the game. He never made it out of the white room. The second they activated the mushroom, something went horribly wrong. Cooper died. His brain fried in 0.04 seconds. A fatal glitch triggered by his own mistake. Katie had warned him to keep his phone off during the test, but when he was left alone for a moment, he turned it back on, hoping to dig up some secrets about the experiment. That interference disrupted the system. He had broken the rules, and in return, the game had taken everything. Cooper never got to fight, never got to understand what was happening, never even had a chance to process his own death. The worst part was that no one even cared. The game developers coldly note his death, chalk it up to a technical error, and move on. Victoria Skillane, White Bear. Victoria Skillane wakes up every morning in a haze of confusion, her mind blank. She doesn't know where she is or why she's there. Panic sets in immediately. Who is she? Where is she? Why does everything feel wrong? Scattered photos show a young girl, a man, and herself. The girl? Her daughter, maybe? Confused and terrified, she steps outside and sees people, lots of them. But something is off. They don't talk to her. They don't help. They just stand there, filming her on their phones. Then a masked man appears with a shotgun and fires. She runs. She's saved by a woman named Jem, who explains that a strange signal appeared on TVs and across the internet, turning most of the population into mindless voyeurs, watching, recording, but never interfering. The few who weren't affected became targets, hunted down by the hunters, violent sadists who use the lawless new world to torment others. But Jem has a plan. They need to reach White Bear, the source of the signal. Destroying it, she says, will break the spell over the people. Victoria, desperate for answers, follows. Along the way, a man named Baxter joins them, claiming to be another survivor. The man turns out to be a hunter and is killed by Jem. Finally, they reach White Bear, but before they can act, hunters attack. In the chaos, Victoria grabs a gun and pulls the trigger. Confetti explodes from the barrel. The world around her shifts. Walls drop away and a crowd erupts in applause. Jem isn't an ally. Baxter isn't dead. The hunters? They're actors. None of it was real. It was all a performance, a show. Every single thing, all of it was staged. Then comes the truth. Her name is Victoria Skillane. She isn't a victim, she's the monster. The man in the photos was her fiancé, Ian. The little girl was Jemima Sykes, a 7-year-old child they kidnapped. While Ian tortured and killed the child, Victoria stood by, filming it all on her phone. Letting it happen, doing nothing to stop it. When the two were caught, Ian took the easy way out, hanging himself in his cell, and Victoria was left to face justice alone. And her punishment is this. She is a prisoner of White Bear Justice Park and is forced to relive the same nightmare every day. Every morning, she wakes up with no memory of her crime and is thrown into the same desperate chase, running for her life. Every night, she's dragged back to the house and strapped to a chair. Then the real pain begins. Wires dig into her skull as her mind is wiped clean, so she never knows what's coming. There's no escaping it. Tomorrow, she'll wake up screaming in the same house with no memory, and it will all begin again. Her fate isn't just worse than death, it's a tailored torture in society's sickest theme park. Matt Trent, White Christmas. Matt Trent always knew how to talk his way out of things. He was the guy with the answers, the fixer, the one who could read people and make them do exactly what he needed. A tech-savvy manipulator making a living off morally bankrupt hustles, but now sitting in a cabin with Joe Potter on Christmas Day. They had been stationed together for 5 years. Barely speaking, Joe wasn't much of a talker, but Matt thrived on conversation. He started with his own story. Back in the real world, Matt worked for Smartelligence, the company behind Cookies, digital consciousness copies of people used for smart home management. He tortured these digital copies into submission. It was a nasty business, but Matt was good at it. But that was just his day job. His real passion, his hobby, was coaching lonely men on how to pick up women using Z-Eyes, a digital implant that lets him and his clients watch interactions in real time. He would feed them lines, shape their confidence, and help them seal the deal. It was all going perfectly until one of his dating coach clients is accidentally murdered on a live stream. Then Matt's operation is exposed. He panicked and wiped every trace of his involvement, deleted the logs, and trashed the evidence. He thought he was in the clear, but his wife caught him. She blocked him, cutting off all visual and audio contact. That was the last time he saw her. She left, took their daughter, and made sure he would never be part of their lives again. To avoid jail time, Matt cuts a deal with the authorities, helped them extract a confession from Joe Potter, and walk free. So Matt did what he did best. He manipulated. Joe eventually confessed, spilling everything. Matt was now free, and sure, he avoided a physical prison, but he soon realizes that he is permanently blocked. And we all know in the Black Mirror universe, that's worse than anything. He was put on the sex offenders registry and was placed on the government's block list, blocked by everyone. He could talk all he wanted, but no one would ever listen again. No one can acknowledge him. No one can even remember who he was. He is just gone. He now lived a life where he was technically alive, but might as well be nothing at all. The entire world moves on, and he is left to wander in total social isolation, a ghost in plain sight. Clayton Lay, Black Museum. Clayton was an ordinary black man framed for the murder of Denise Stockley. Whether he was guilty or not didn't even matter, because the system didn't care. He was sentenced to death by the electric chair, but his punishment didn't stop there. His appeals kept failing, and the execution date crept closer. Then Rollo Haynes came knocking. He had a deal to offer. If Clayton was executed, Haynes would copy his consciousness and turn it into something profitable. In return, Clayton's family would get a cut of the earnings. His wife begged him not to, but for Clayton, it sounded like a chance to do something for them, even if he wouldn't be around to see it. With no hope left, Clayton did what he thought was best. He signed himself over. Big mistake. The execution came. The electric chair did its job, and Haynes was there to collect what he was promised. He extracted Clayton's digital consciousness and uploaded it into a holographic exhibit in the Black Museum. Then he turned Clayton into an attraction, the Black Museum's main event. The idea was that the visitors could relive his execution over and over again. Visitors came pouring in. Press a button, watch Clayton's hologram scream in agony as he's electrocuted, then reset and do it again. But for Clayton, it was real every time. He felt every jolt. He felt his body fry. He felt the pain of dying, but never got the peace of death. Instead, he was reset, trapped, and forced to endure his most painful moment for eternity. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't die. He couldn't fight back. When the 10-second limit was up, he reset, waiting to be someone else's entertainment. The museum goers loved it. Haynes threw in a souvenir because why not? After each execution, a small automated dispenser spat out a keychain with a tiny snapshot of Clayton, frozen mid-electrocution, locked in a single moment of eternal torment. This wasn't punishment, it was torture as entertainment. A man's suffering turned into a business model. While death is private, Clayton's torment was turned into a spectacle, consumed by grinning strangers who had no idea or no care that he was still in there, still feeling it all. He was in a never-ending cycle of pain, death, and rebirth, all so people could have a good time. Clayton wasn't just killed, he was commercialized. And the bummer? There was a good chance he was innocent. Although in the end, Clayton's daughter freed his trapped consciousness and burned the Black Museum down. But then it was a little too late. Kenny, shut up and dance. Kenny had always been quiet, timid. He worked a boring job as a busboy, living a pretty unremarkable life. One day, he came home exhausted, ready to shut out the world. but his sister had been on his laptop. Worse, she had infected it with malware. He panicked, scrambling for a fix, and downloaded a supposed anti-malware tool. Then he does something that should have stayed private. He uses his laptop to watch something he shouldn't have, and soon things spiraled out of control. The next thing he knew, an email popped up. Someone had been watching, recording. They had footage of him in his most private moment, and unless he did exactly what they said, they would send it to everyone he knew. His family, his friends, his co-workers. Kenny had no choice. At first, it's simple. Run an errand, follow instructions, don't ask questions. But things spiral fast. Kenny is ordered to rob a bank. Then he's sent to a forest where he's forced into a fight to the death with another blackmailed victim. By this point, he's broken, bleeding, terrified, and realizing there's no way out. Even after all that, he clings to the hope that if he plays along, he can survive this, fix this, and move on. He was wrong. Just as he thought it was over, his phone buzzed. His mother's voice, shaking, crying, devastated. It finally dawned upon him. The hackers, they were never going to let him go. As Kenny stumbles home, beaten and destroyed, his phone buzzes with one last message that they had sent the video out anyway. Kenny doesn't die, but he might as well have. His secret, his shame, his crime, it was all out in the open. Turns out Kenny was a pedophile, and his mother had seen the video. His life was completely ruined. The cops show up, and Kenny is left standing in the wreckage of everything he's done. A bank robber, a murderer, and worst of all, he was exposed for exactly what he was. He was going to prison, his face plastered everywhere, his name permanently tied to his crime. And for what? Because some faceless hackers decided to play a game. Kenny's world had ended, but he was still alive, forced to face what he had become. His reputation, his life, his freedom, all gone. Robert Daly, USS Callister. Robert Daly was a genius, a socially awkward, reclusive coder, but a brilliant one. At first glance, Robert seems like a textbook underdog, the underappreciated genius behind a massive virtual reality multiplayer game, Infinity, that lets players command their own starships, exploring an artificially generated universe. However, his business partner, Walton, takes all the credit, and his coworkers mock him behind his back. But instead of confronting reality like a normal, sane person, Robert found another way to get what he wanted. He had a solution. A few years ago, Robert had either created or obtained a device capable of cloning consciousness from human DNA. And it was quite simple. Take a DNA sample, process it through his home system, and upload the resulting consciousness into Infinity. No one would ever know. No one would ever be able to stop him. And Walton was the first test subject. But Robert wasn't satisfied with just Walton. He wanted more. He needed a crew, so he started collecting. Robert steals the DNA of his real-life co-workers, clones them into his game, and forces their digital copies to obey his every command. But here's the sick part. The game isn't just some harmless fantasy. These aren't just NPCs, but fully conscious versions of real people trapped in a universe where Robert rules as a god. Robert gets away with this for years, treating his virtual prisoners like disposable puppets. But control is never permanent. His crew found a way to fight back, and Robert is left behind, permanently locked inside his own game. Worse, his game is getting deleted. Robert's world shuts down around him. Death would have been quick. Instead, Robert's stuck in an empty digital space with no way out, unable to die, unable to escape. And in the real world, his body sat slumped at his desk, the do not disturb sign on the door keeping anyone from checking on him. As Infinity faded into nothing, Robert Daly ceased to exist. Erased in both the digital and physical world. Left to die alone in the game, he spent years playing dictator. Michael Callow, the national anthem. Michael Callow is the Prime Minister of the UK, who one day woke up to a phone call that would change his life forever. He rushed into an emergency meeting and learned Princess Susanna had been kidnapped. The terms? Clear. The Prime Minister had to have sex with a pig. On live television at 4 p.m. And if he refuses, the princess would be executed. At first, Callow refused outright, and everyone in the room seemed to agree. This was impossible, unthinkable. Maybe they can find the kidnapper. Maybe there's some other solution that doesn't involve national humiliation. The public was watching, waiting. Callow and his advisors scramble for a way out. Soon, a severed finger, supposedly belonging to Susanna, was delivered straight to the media. This changes everything. Just hours before, the public had been overwhelmingly seemingly against the demand, insisting that no civilized society should expect such a thing. But the severed finger changed everything. Fear replaced outrage. Polls flipped. Now the majority believed Kahlo had to do it, and just like that, he was trapped. At 4 p.m., the entire nation watched as Kahlo broadcasts himself performing the act. The princess, found completely unharmed just before the broadcast began. By the time the truth came out, it didn't matter. Kahlo survived, but his life was over. His reputation was shattered. His dignity was gone. Even though the public respects him for what he did, they'll never see him as a leader again. He has to live with the humiliation, forever branded as the pig guy, and his wife refused to even look at him. Michael Kahlo hadn't died that day, not in the way people expected, but the man he had been before, he was gone forever. Death would have given him dignity, and the biggest tragedy, it was all pointless. Marvelous verdict. At the end of the day, Black Mirror isn't merely about frightening you with technology. It makes you pause, mouth open, and rethink your entire digital life. The people we talked about, they didn't just die. They got trapped, tormented, or turned into something that hardly resembled a human anymore. Think about it. Would you rather take your chances in a standard horror movie where at least you die, or in Black Mirror, where you might spend forever as an abandoned consciousness in some forgotten toy? Makes getting chased by a guy in a mask sound pretty nice, huh? And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.